Hi everyone, it's Alex, and this is all of the books that I read in January. January was a really interesting month, mainly because I didn't think I'd be able to read anything since being in my last semester of grad school. Luckily though, I did manage to read 5 things this January, and I really think it was a good mix of everything. And the first book I read was Nasty Woman. I've already talked about this on my channel in its own separate video, but I think out of the contemporary discussion on what it means to be feminist, what it means to be a black woman in America, as well as other ideas of the women's rights movement that seems to be reshaping our history right now. This is a very introspective and articulate and really insightful collection, and not to compare collections that we have like this already, but if you were to start with one at least, I think starting here would be a really great option. The second thing I read in January was A Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams. I haven't read a play since Our Town by Thornton Wilder, and I've always heard about A Streetcar Named Desire and how its themes are kind of subtle, but at the same time really demand your attention. I've always heard about Blanche's really big monologue about what it means to fall in love, but at the same time understanding her character and what she went through in the past. I think it really shapes and makes me even more sympathetic for who she is as a person, as well as how people like her sister and her sister's husband and other people react to her. This was a really thought-provoking play, and I can really imagine just how effective it would have been if I were to have ever seen it in person. The third book I read in January was The Vegetarian by Han Kang. I've already read Human Acts by Han Kang, and I've been really meaning to get around to this one. And I really enjoyed this book so much. I feel like if this were the first thing I read by Han Kang, I would have been blown away. But to me, it's clear how much Han Kang has grown since writing Human Acts after this work, that she's been able to think a bit more strategically about story, because for here, it is, to me at least, pretty simple, but definitely still powerful and effective, and definitely met with some type of a very literary fiction type of ideas going on. And it's really funny to me because I read this right after reading A Streetcar Named Desire, and I think it's so interesting the parallels going on. The Vegetarian's about a young woman who decides to be vegetarian, and basically how that action alienates the people around her, specifically her family. And similarly, in A Streetcar Named Desire, there's also the case with Blanche visiting her sister in this unknown place, and how people react to her as well. So for me, I think with The Vegetarian and A Streetcar Named Desire, it does a really great job for both books to really discuss ideas of mental health, and how it's not really about, a part of it is about how others understand how we perceive our own health, whether mentally or physically. But most importantly, the ideas of securing that agency, that letting yourself be any version of yourself you want to be should really concern you the most, and then you try to understand how you communicate with others. If you haven't read either of those works, that's not going to make any sense at all, but I hope that would even encourage you more to pick up The Vegetarian as well as A Streetcar Named Desire. And the fourth thing I read this January is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. I've already talked pretty extensively, as well as in a very tired fashion, about this book on my channel, but this is a book that's definitely staying with me. I think the more I think about it, I think James Baldwin does a great job at developing the quiet motivations behind characters. To me, each character in here feels powerful, and as if they've lived years of life already before the events unfold in this book. It's really interesting because I feel like each character kind of demands attention, but at the same time, I feel like I approach every character in here with some form of sympathy. So it is quite short. I think it was only about 150 pages, so I kind of breezed my way through this one, but it is regarded as a classic, but I think this is definitely one of the more accessible classics that you could read if you haven't read classics before. And the last book I read in January to really exit the month is When They Call You a Terrorist, a Black Lives Matter memoir. This was probably one of the most disappointing reads that I can remember I've read in a while. Not to say it's really a matter of the content. I think this book does a great job at organizing how Black Lives Matter was conceived, and how these really personal anecdotes kind of led to this buildup of a movement that we know today. However, with the writing style in here, it's, to me, very poor. Reading this was like reading sort of like a student really long personal essay that I would read in class. There are a lot of things often repeated in here. It's as if it's like not expected to be read in one sitting. It's sort of a book that you kind of just pick up and read sections of at a time. To me, I think that really undermines the reader in trying to think that the reader isn't able to kind of follow along with sort of the sentiments behind the content being portrayed. And with memoir, I think it's such an interesting thing to consider that when we read memoir, we don't want to be dismissive of the experience ever. But at the same time, we don't want to fall under sort of the spell of how memoir is trying to communicate ideas. And with this, I feel like there is sort of that creative liberty of trying to write in a way that you think a writer is supposed to be writing creatively. But to me, it just feels that these instances where I can recognize where it feels like writing is supposed to happen or is trying to happen, it feels a bit gimmicky to me. Which is a complete shame because I feel like all of that sort of attempt is getting muddled behind the real backbone of the powerful stories that are in here. But to me, it's clear that Patrisse Khan-Cullors is not someone that's familiar kind of with the craft of how to build a memoir, at least writing a writing style, but there's definitely sort of the material there that can be suited to this genre, at least, of a memoir. For me, I would think I would have loved this a lot more if it was an audiobook or if this was told maybe through a series of interviews, but just within the memoir genre, I just don't think it's really working. Those are all the books I have and all the books I read in January. If you happen to have read any of these books, I would love to know what you thought of them down below in the comments, or also just in general, if just sort of leaving a comment with what you read in January, I think that would be great too. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.